And this is something that's probably going to affect everybody in the room to some degree. Fortunately, from the swine perspective, the veterinarians and producers have some knowledge of what the Veterinary Feed Directive is all about. We've dealt with this actually since the very first implementation of the VFD. And so we've sort of been down that path. I really feel sorry for the cattle guys. They have no clue what's coming at them. It's going to be a huge seed change. And we've got some dramatic changes as well. I mean, this is going to take us from traditionally what's been 2 products, now today is actually 3 products on the VFD that have swine labels, all the way to practically mostly every product we use is going to be VFD, with the exception of a few that we'll talk about in a minute. So it's going to be a big change from a producer standpoint, where producers aren't going to be able to just call up the feed mill or go to the local feed store and pick up antimicrobials that they need. There's going to be a process that everybody has to go through. So there's going to be some huge changes there. And I left quite a bit of time in this program for questions, because every time I talk about this, there's tons more questions than there are answers. So as we go through this, please feel free to stop me at any time, ask a question, that's fine. I may or may not know the answer. That's part of the problem, is that even though I don't know the answer, the problem is FDA doesn't know the answer. So there's going to be a huge learning curve as we go through this process. So just to get everybody on the same page, we'll back up a little and talk about antibiotic regulations and how they're approved and what that process is, because it all ties together with this VFD. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is the agency that regulates both animal and human antibiotics. Historically, there were 2 categories of approval, that being OTC, or over-the-counter, which meant that you didn't need any kind of oversight to utilize those products. Anybody could go in and get the product, use it as is on the label, and that's the way they were regulated. The other was prescription, and everybody's familiar with prescriptions from the human side. I'm sure it's very similar on the veterinary side. But in that case, obviously, you had to have a doctor or a veterinarian signing a prescription to give you access to those antimicrobials. Well, in the early 90s, Congress decided that there needed to be more oversight on particularly feed-grade antimicrobials, and some limitation, particularly on newly approved products, on how those products would be used. So when FDA sat down and started going through this, like I said, they only had 2 methods at that time to approve products, OTC and prescription. They were trying to get away from OTC. That was the congressional mandate. They didn't want to go to prescription, because prescriptions are actually overseen by each individual state board of pharmacy. So what that would have meant was you would have to have applied 50 different sets of regulations to feed-grade antimicrobials. The FDA didn't want to do that, producers didn't want to do that, veterinarians didn't want to do that, and quite frankly, the state pharmacy boards didn't want to do that, because they don't know diddly squat about feed and how to administer drugs through the feed. So they didn't want to do that either. So that's how they came up with what was called the Veterinary Feed Directive. And basically, the Veterinary Feed Directive was a method to apply veterinary oversight to basically at that time newly approved drugs without having to go the whole prescription route. So that's how we wound up with a VFD. It was implemented in 1996. As I said, it provides for the veterinary oversight without requiring all the steps and issues you go through to write a prescription. Currently today, there's 3 swine products that are VFD, the new fluoropomatil and avilamycin, which was just recently approved as a VFD product. So again, veterinarians and swine producers have had some experience working with these products in the past. So all of this is not going to be totally foreign, but there are some significant changes that FDA has made in the VFD process. The other thing to consider is that on the labels, if you read the labels of any of the antimicrobial products out there, there'll be 1 of 4 approval categories on there, either for disease treatment, disease control, or disease prevention. Now, all 3 of those, FDA agrees, are considered to be therapeutic or treatment type uses. And this is important because of some of the activist groups out there attempting to minimize the use of antimicrobials. They make the distinction between therapy uses and subtherapeutic or non-therapeutic uses, as they like to call them. But since FDA has agreed that these are all three actually therapeutic uses, they feel that they are necessary for animal health and welfare. So that gives us some working room there. The fourth category was growth promotion or improvement of nutritional feed efficiency. This is the one that the latest efforts from FDA are going to address. Basically, as a result of 209 and 213, the growth promotion label claim is going to be removed from all of these products that are considered to be medically important from the human side. So that's what those two guidances address specifically. So medically important, that's a key point to keep in mind, is that it doesn't actually affect 100% of the drugs we use, although it's going to affect most of them, but it directly affects those that FDA has deemed to be medically important for human use. So it's those antibiotics that are the same or in the same classes as antibiotics used to treat humans. Unfortunately, most of the antibiotics we use fall into that category, with the exception of bacitracin, mecadox or carbadox, narracin, bambamycin, and tiamulin. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. So I mentioned the guidance for industry number 209. That's the guidance that set this whole thing off. And one thing about guidances for industry, they don't have the power of law. They are basically a document that states how FDA, in this case, interprets their regulations and how they plan to utilize their enforcement capabilities and move forward on a particular issue. In this case, it's the production use of antimicrobials. So while you can say that these are voluntary guidances, and a lot of the activist groups like to point that out, that there isn't regulation controlling this process, it's all voluntary. Voluntary is a very subjective term. It was more voluntold than voluntary, I think, because basically, FDA said, we would like for you, Mr. Manufacturer, to remove those claims from your label. If you choose not to do that, then we will start pursuing a regulatory path to basically make you do that. So it's sort of voluntary. The other key point that FDA made in this was that they determined that production uses, growth promotion, and feed efficiency were not unsafe, they were injudicious. And that took a number of lawyers within FDA to come up with that term. They didn't want to declare them unsafe, because if they did that, then that opens up the whole scientific discussion about their approval process and under what circumstances are these products now not safe. Is it not safe for animals, not safe for humans, not safe for the environment? What does that mean? That would have called into question a very lengthy process to have achieved what they've now basically achieved voluntarily. So they called them injudicious. They didn't call them unsafe. Guidance 209 requires other uses of the same classes of antibiotics to come under veterinary oversight. And again, we talked about voluntary and what that meant. Subsequent to number 209, FDA put forward guidance 213, which basically is the roadmap or the guidance for the pharmaceutical industries to how they're going to go about removing those claims from the label and transitioning those label claims into VFDs and other product categories. So 213 really didn't directly affect us per se. It was more of the manufacturer's side. So currently, as I said, we've dealt with the VFD since its inception in 1996. And the way it's currently written is that the veterinarians had to write a VFD they had to estimate the amount of feed that was going to be consumed in a certain time period. And you can all guess what the problems are associated with that. It's seasonal. You don't know how much feed they're going to be eating. You don't know really how many animals are going to be in a barn. All of these kinds of questions that really made making that estimate very, very difficult. The way the current rules were set up was the actual original copy of the VFD, that actual piece of paper, had to go to the feed mill within 5 days of placing that order. So somehow you had to get that actual hard copy to the feed mill. You couldn't call them up, you couldn't fax it, you couldn't do it any way electronically. It had to actually, that piece of paper had to move, which was very problematic. The veterinary feed directive had to be written within a valid veterinary client-patient relationship, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute as well. Refills, very similar to prescriptions. The refill process was not very straightforward in the current process. And what a refill was is very similar to a human prescription, where the doctor says that the prescription's good for X amount of time, and then you can refill the prescription during that period of time. The other thing is record keeping, and this is one of the areas that we really need to concentrate on. Record keeping is that end of the day thing that nobody wants to do, but it's critical in this case. If FDA shows up on your farm, which they have the right to do unannounced and for no other cause than to ask you to see these records, they expect these records are going to be there. And you have to hold these records for 2 years. So that's sort of the current system and some of the challenges we have with the current system. And I'll say here up front that we had lots of long discussions with FDA about these issues. And to their credit, they actually were very responsive, and they were very interested in trying to make this system work. And I will say that they were responsive to that. There's still issues with the system they came up with, but I think in a lot of ways it's better than the one we currently have to deal with, particularly when you consider now you're going to be looking at multiple species, having VFDs, and a lot more products that we've got to deal with. So again, this addresses only the FDA medically important antimicrobials, which again basically is everything except the 5 that are listed there. Those actually are going to remain available for growth promotion use and over the counter, just as they are as is currently on the label for each of those products. So the new VFD final rule will actually go into effect in October of this year. So what that means is that any product that currently has a VFD approval on the label, or any other product that transitions to VFD after October 2015, will now have to fall under these new VFD requirements we're going to talk about. In other words, the veterinarians are going to have to comply, and the producers are going to have to comply with these new regulations. The growth promotion and nutritional efficiency labels are scheduled to be removed by the end of 2016. So there's a bit of a lag time there between October 2015 and the deadline for the removal of the labels being at the end of the following year. So really, it's probably going to vary some from manufacturer to manufacturer as to when they make these label changes, but I imagine a lot of them will be towards that deadline period. And not only the drug manufacturers have to be concerned about this, but so do the feed manufacturers. They've got thousands of labels that they've got to change, and it's going to be a huge nightmare for them to actually comply with this within that time frame. So it's a very involved process. But this will impact disease prevention, control, and treatment. Those will be the 3 label claims that are left on feed-grade antimicrobials, and all of those will come under the VFD. Also, water medications are going to come under prescription as well as a part of this. So from a producer standpoint, what does this really mean? Again, most of the growth promotion uses that we're all very familiar with and have used frequently, those will mostly end by the end of 2016. Most feed-grade antibiotics will no longer be available over the counter and will require this veterinary order or this veterinary feed directive. And again, antibiotics through the water are going to require a prescription as well. This is a significant regulatory step that's going to result in how antibiotics are actually used on the farm and how producers can actually access those antibiotics. And this has been one of the concerns that we've raised with FDA and that they are aware of, is that producers that are in rural areas where they may not have a ready access to a veterinarian are going to be very challenged on how they can actually access these antimicrobials, particularly with the requirement that we're going to talk about in a minute, where you have to have a valid VCPR in order to write one of these prescriptions. It's not going to be a simple matter of calling up a veterinarian and they write you a VFD and you go on your merry way. Once the labels are changed, it will be illegal to utilize antibiotics to promote growth. So this has been another issue that the activist groups have brought up is that because it's voluntary, all that will happen is that veterinarians will start prescribing antimicrobials for growth promotion but calling it prevention. So that's sort of the battle that we're dealing at this point. To do that would be flat out illegal. You cannot deviate, even a veterinarian cannot deviate from exactly what's on the label when you're prescribing feed-grade antimicrobials. You have to give it for the indication that's on the label, for the length of time that's on the label, at the dosage that's on the label, all of those things. There is no deviation from that. So you could not legally prescribe an antimicrobial for growth promotion. All right, so as I said, producers are going to lose some antibiotics that they've routinely had access to. That's going to be a big change for some folks, particularly those that do their own on-farm mixing. It's going to be more difficult, more cumbersome to get access to those antimicrobials. There may be increased costs, and there'll certainly be increased time spent, particularly from the veterinary standpoint, on making sure that these VFDs are current and kept up to date and justified. And producers, again, will need to develop that close relationship with their veterinarian. So what's the veterinary side of this, and what are their responsibilities? First and foremost, the veterinarian must be licensed. The question has come up is, does the veterinarian have to be licensed in the state in which the mill is in, or the state in which the pigs are fed? How does that work? The ruling from FDA has been that they can write a VFD for the state in which the pigs are going to be fed. This is all subject, though, to the individual state veterinary practice acts, and it depends on what the practice act is as to whether or not you as a veterinarian actually have to be licensed in that state, or if you can be licensed where the pigs arose and write that prescription. So there is going to be another layer of legal concern there that we have to be aware of. The veterinarian must be operating in the course of practice and in compliance, and they must write the VFD orders within the context of a VCPR. So we've talked about a VCPR a couple times. Let's take a look at what that really means. VCPR stands for Veterinary Client-Patient Relationship. And the issue with the VCPR, when FDA first started looking at writing new rules for the VFD, they were going to what they call decouple, or remove the requirement that there be a VCPR from the new regulation. And their reasoning behind that, which I thought was fairly sound, was that the VCPR actually arose in relation to veterinarians being allowed to utilize antimicrobials in an extra label manner. And I've already told you there is no extra label use of feed-grade antimicrobials. So right off the bat, that's why do you need a VCPR if it's related to the regulatory use of feed-grade antimicrobials in a extra label manner. Second was, there are multiple definitions of the VCPR out there. There's only one that's codified in federal law, and that is the one that's associated with AMDUCA through FDA that has to do with this extra label drug use question. Other than that, AVMA has a definition. All of the state, well, not all, some of the states' practice acts have a requirement for a VCPR. Some of them do not. So there's a lot of variability in what that VCPR actually entails. So there was a lot of pressure on FDA, a lot through AVMA actually, to require that there be a VCPR. And a lot of this came also from the bovine practitioners because they're concerned particularly about drive-by VFDs, as they call it, just calling up the veterinarian and he mails you a VFD or whatever. So they wanted some stipulation in there that there needed to be this relationship between the veterinarian and the client. Their conclusion on this was that they were going to include a VCPR requirement, and that requirement would fall to the state. If your state has a VCPR requirement within their Veterinary Practice Act, then you had to comply with the wording that was in the state Veterinary Practice Act. If the state did not have a statement, then you fell back to the federal guidelines for a VCPR. And those have basically three minimum requirements. and that is that the veterinarian engages with the client to assume responsibility for making clinical judgments about the patient's health. In other words, you're familiar with the animals and with the disease process and those kinds of things. That the veterinarian has sufficient knowledge of the patient by the virtue of an actual physical examination and or visits to the facility where the patient is managed, and that they provide any necessary follow-up evaluation or care. So there's still a lot of gray area in that, and it's not FDA's intent to define veterinary practice. They would prefer AVMA and the individual states do that. So they purposefully left this gray, and a lot of people always ask me, well, how often do I have to be out on the farm? Well, you need to use your medical judgment and your association with the farm to make that determination. This does not say you have to be out there in any specific time frame. It says that you have to have knowledge of what's going on the farm and what the health situations and those kinds of things are. And a lot of that can be gained if you have, production people that are out there all the time, if you're seeing all the diagnostic reports and the medical records and those kinds of things. So it's not stipulated within these. Now, it may be stipulated in your individual state requirements. So again, as long as the state requirements comply with these three minimum guidelines, then you have to follow the state requirements, which may be more than this. So again, more veterinary responsibilities. Can only issue a VFD that is in compliance with the approved use. Again, no extra label drug use there. You have to prepare a written VFD, nonverbal. And what that means now is that, as I told you before, the way it is today, you have to actually move that hard copy. No longer do you have to actually move the hard copy physically. You can now do that electronically through your own system or a third-party system. Or you can fax it, all of those kinds of methods. You cannot still pick up the phone, though, and just call it in like your doctor might a prescription. So that's why it says written nonverbal. And the VFD requires the inclusion of certain information. And there's really quite a bit of information that has to be associated with that VFD. And I don't know that you can read this, but a lot of it is sort of the same information you would put on a prescription. You have to have the veterinarian's contact information, the client's contact information, the actual premises where the animals are that are going to receive this medicated feed, the date that you issued that VFD, and the expiration date of the VFD. Now, that's another key point, is the expiration date. As part of the current VFD approval process, some of the drugs out there that have VFD labels also have an expiration date. And I'm not talking about the expiration date for the product. We're talking about the expiration date associated with the order that you write up. And that expiration date, again, is determined one of two ways. If there is an expiration date on the product label, you have to apply that same expiration date to your VFD. It cannot deviate from that. And why is that? There's no extra label drug use on feed-grade antimicrobials, so you cannot deviate from the label. If the expiration date is 90 days, that's the expiration date for your veterinary feed directive order. If there isn't a date on there, which as all these other products transition to VFD, there won't be a date on there because it wasn't a requirement for their approval process. The veterinarian then has some flexibility to define what that expiration date will be, but it cannot exceed 6 months. So the longest a veterinary feed directive order can be effective is 6 months. Okay, and on that 6 month plus 1 day, although you may still have that feed on the farm, it's illegal to feed it without another VFD that carries you through the next period of time. So yep. Was there a question or just a comment? So that's the stipulation point there. Was it's not illegal to have the feed on the farm necessarily, but it would be illegal if you were feeding it. The species and production class of the animals that are to be fed that VFD feed. Now here's another key point, is that remember I told you with the VFD today we have to estimate the amount of feed that the animals are going to consume. This is one of the things that they've done away with, and now you have to estimate an approximate number of animals that are going to be fed that VFD within that expiration period, which is, again, it's an estimate, but I think it's a lot more reasonable estimate than trying to guess how much feed you're going to have to feed. You're going to have to list on there what the indication is for feeding that medicated feed and the level of medicated drug in the feed and the duration of use. You need to put on there the withdrawal time and any special instructions that you may have regarding feeding of that product. You have to list on there the number of reorders or refills that are authorized. Now, this is another key point we talked about earlier. You remember when we talked about refills. The issue here became very confusing with how this was going to be allowed. And so what FDA decided to do was, if the product label allows for a refill, then you can write your VFD order for that number of refills. Currently today, there are no products that have on their label that allow for a refill. So today, refills are not allowed, would not be allowed. It has to be on the label in order to actually write a refill. Now in the future, as these product labels transition or as new products are brought on, some company may put a refill stipulation on there, and if they do, you can do that. But currently today, there are no products, either VFD or otherwise, that allow on the label for a refill. The veterinary feed order, again, also has to contain the statement, use of feed containing this veterinary feed directive drug in a manner other than as directed on the labeling, extra label use is not permitted. And also an affirmation of the intent if you're using combination VFD drugs, and we'll talk about this in detail in a minute, but you also have to have some intent for how that's to be used. And then you have to sign it, either electronically or a written signature. All right, more responsibilities for the veterinarian. They must include certain drug-specific information for each VFD drug when you're authorizing that drug combination be used. In other words, if you've got a product that contains 2 or more VFD drugs, you have to have on there the authorization for each of those products individually. If you're writing an order for a product that involves both VFD drugs and over-the-counter, those 5 that we talked about that could still be used over-the-counter, then you have to stipulate on the VFD order whether or not that order only involves a non-combination product that contains only the VFD drug, or if it can be a combination product that also contains the OTC product. And if it does, then you have to write down, what's the indication that you're using the VFD for. The veterinarian is now the keeper of the original copy of the VFD. It's up to he or she to provide both the distributor and the client a copy of that VFD as well. And all 3 entities have to retain that VFD for a period of no less than 2 years. And it must be available for inspection by FDA. And again, just one final point that I'll make is, again, that extra labeled, it's a key point, and I keep trying to drive it home, but there can't be any deviation in how we use feed-grade antimicrobials from specifically what's on that label.